Okay, Tom, you've got this magnum opus coming out, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, which is not something you dreamed up and decided to write a few Saturdays ago. This is a chestnut you've been warming now for 30 and 40 years. So, given that seems to be a climax of your not just your study but your real deep wrestling with Paul, what he's about, what he's interested in, and all the various schools of interpretation of Paul, what do you think is going to be your main contribution into Pauline studies in this book,
Yeah,
Paul and the Faithfulness of God?
it does go back a long way for me. I started to try seriously to write this book in the mid-1980s when I was teaching at McGill University in Montreal. And I remember vividly shaping it and thinking, now we need to say this and we need to do that and so on. And then being frustrated that I found there were other things I needed to do first to kind of lay the groundwork. And I've been working my way back to this again and again, and now we're virtually there. And one of the big things for me has been that I grew up in a scholarly world where people would regularly say, well, Paul was a bit muddled about this, and that bit of his letters, he didn't really mean that. That was just some stuff he dashed off, but the real centre is this. And so I grew up in a world where it was common to say that Paul was inconsistent, incoherent, that his central ideas don't quite fit together, that some of them are brilliant, but then others of them sort of fall away. And people would excuse that by saying, well, he was just dashing these letters off, and he wasn't a systematic theologian. He wasn't trying to make all the dots join up, and so on. And I want to say, well, yes, he often did write at speed. He often did write very much to a context. He wasn't writing successive issues of a kind of Calvin's Institutes. He wasn't saying, here's the first volume of my systematics now. Here, these are letters. They're real letters to real people. However, the fact that they're real letters to real people doesn't of itself mean that he's inconsistent. I write dozens and dozens of emails to people and a fair number of letters to people. Often people write to me about quite different problems, and often I don't really know very much about their situations, and so I give advice and encouragement, whatever. But I hope that if you put all my letters and emails together, you wouldn't find major inconsistencies. You might, but I hope you wouldn't find major inconsistencies. So the fact that something is done on the run, on the fly, and to different situations doesn't of itself mean that the ideas don't match up. The question is, how do Paul's ideas match up? And so people have tried to say, well, justification is the centre of Paul, and all those other things about being in Christ or ethics or whatever, yeah, that's sort of important, but it's off at the side and it doesn't quite fit. Or Paul is an apocalyptic theologian. He's all about God breaking in and doing a new thing, and all that other stuff about Abraham and the Old Testament, that's sort of around there and he plays with it, but it doesn't quite fit, and so on and so forth. And people have had all sorts of different ways of putting Paul together. So that's really part of the centre of my project, is to say, is there a way in which Paul does make sense? And my argument quite simply is that in Jewish theology, such as it is, there are three main themes: God, God's people, God's future, monotheism, election, eschatology. And that what Paul has done is to take each of those central Jewish themes and to rethink it, to rework it around Jesus and the Spirit. And so I've, at the heart of the book, part 3 of my book, I've tried to work out in considerable detail, taking all the relevant texts, I hope, into consideration, the way in which Paul talks about God in the light of Jesus and the Spirit, so that this is a very Jewish vision, but completely refocused around Jesus and the Spirit. The way in which he talks about God's people, likewise, the way in which he talks about the future for God's world and God's people. So that's really the centre of it, and I've argued that Paul is actually a deeply, radically coherent Jewish, or if you like, refreshed Jewish thinker. That's really at the centre of it. And then as we pan out from that, I am trying to say that Paul was doing that in the service of the mission which he had. He wasn't an armchair thinker. He was doing this because he believed it was his job, it was his vocation, to plant churches, i.e. little communities of Jesus followers, in Caesar's world in such a way that they would be communities shaped by this message, by this gospel, by this theology, so that they would be united, so that they would be holy, so that they would be able to take forward the mission of God. So that's at the heart of the book. But I found in order to do that, that I needed to do some quite interesting, to me, other things as well, because Paul lived in three worlds at once. He lived in the Jewish world, he lived in the Hellenistic world, the Greek world of late antiquity, the world that Alexander the Great had sort of made the Greek world a few hundred years before, but he lived in the world of the Roman Empire. And so what I've tried to do is to sketch the way in which those worlds worked and to see how Paul belongs in those worlds, the world of Jewish culture, the world of ancient philosophy, the world of ancient religion, the world of ancient empire and politics. So the first chunk of the book, part one, is quite a long exploration of Paul's Jewish, Greek and Roman worlds. And then we put Paul within those worlds and we say, what was his own worldview, his own mindset? And then that sets the context for saying, here is his theology and this is how it's coherent. And then in the final section of the book, we revisit those worlds of empire, religion, philosophy, Jewish culture. And then we say, so what contribution does Paul make in those worlds? How does it play out? What does this community, this theology look like in those worlds? So it's a quite different project from what I thought I was doing 40 years ago, but there are all sorts of continuities with what I was doing, but obviously my thought and my understanding of Paul has developed a lot over that time, and I've tried to do that in dialogue with most of the major current schools of interpretation in at least the modern Western world of scholarship, though I'm very much aware that there are people writing about Paul in other areas that I haven't studied in detail, like African theologians and Asian theologians, and I regret that because there's such a welter of scholarship to get your head round in the Western world at the moment, I haven't been able to do too much beyond that. But I hope that others might be stimulated to take what I've done and to say, how does this mesh with or dialogue with people in those worlds? Because Paul, just to sum it up, I cut my intellectual teeth on people like Plato and Aristotle when I was a student, and Paul ranks with them as a thinker. He is drawing together huge ideas, complex, abstract and concrete discussions, and putting it into a new synthesis and doing it with a power and a passion that has seldom been rivaled ever since. And it seems to me, therefore, Paul is not just a figure that some Christians might like to study if they had a few wet Thursday afternoons to do it on. Paul is a thinker who remains seminal for the whole world, for the whole world history. And I hope that by writing the book in the way that I have, I've made this accessible and available, not just to Christian theologians who might want to read it, though I hope they will, but to a much wider audience as well. That would be my aim and hope.